Will you hear these words from the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, verses 1 to 8? For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to break down, and a time to build up. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to throw away stones, and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek, and a time to lose. A time to keep, and a time to throw away. A time to tear, and a time to sow. A time to keep silent, and a time to speak. A time to love, and a time to hate. A time for war, and a time for peace. In the early 2000s, Saturday Night Live had an ongoing sketch centering around its title character, Debbie Downer. No matter what circumstance Debbie Downer found herself in, she could always find a way to dampen the mood. Various sketches over the years found her at parties, at weddings, even at Disney World, places and events that should be great moments of joy in people's lives. And Debbie Downer, she would always find a way to bring those around her down. In one particular sketch, she finds herself at a friend's wedding, sitting at a table and reminding the table that she's sitting at that the only thing higher than gas prices right now is the divorce rate. Needless to say, Debbie Downer was not particularly popular with those surrounding her. If I had to personify the book of Ecclesiastes based solely on the way that people describe it, I would probably personify it as Debbie Downer. When people talk about Ecclesiastes, they generally don't know tons about it other than the one key word of the book: meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And so begins the book of Ecclesiastes in the way that I would expect a book written by Debbie Downer to begin. And the claim of the meaninglessness of life continues repeatedly in the 12 chapters that follow. We, of course, are today continuing in our year-long sermon series that we're simply calling The Gospel. We're turning today to look at the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, this year we're going through each and every book of the Bible, and we've been searching to uncover the gospel, the good news that we proclaim to the world. And so we've done this each week, believing that Jesus himself is the good news. And we've declared each week that we believe that Jesus, the crucified and risen Messiah, is Lord, and that is the gospel. And secondly, we've been looking to each book of the Bible this year because we believe that the Bible is a unified story that leads to Jesus. Scripture is all about and all points to Jesus, this good news that we as Christians declare to the world. We began looking at the books known as the wisdom literature last week. And we seek in doing so to uncover some of the wisdom that God provides to his people in and through these books. Now, one of the key things that we learned last week is that God is the source of all true wisdom. All wisdom comes from him. And so as we looked at Proverbs last week, we see that Proverbs provides a very upbeat and optimistic view of the world. The wisdom provided there is basically, if you listen to the teaching and wisdom of the book, then things will go well for you. And if you think I'm oversimplifying that, then just listen to how Proverbs chapter 3 begins. It says this: "My child, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and abundant welfare they will give you." So that chapter begins, if you listen to my teaching, your life will be long and go well. That's kind of the overall thrust of the book. If you act with wisdom, then life will go well. The book of Ecclesiastes, however, paints a very different picture. And this is why the wisdom books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, are all meant to be read in tension with one another. as they provide different viewpoints, very different viewpoints, on how the world works and how God's wisdom plays into life and how we should live. Proverbs has an idealistic view of the world, that if you do good, life will be good. But Ecclesiastes has a contrasting view of the world that some people incorrectly interpret as just sheer nihilism, claiming that Ecclesiastes teaches that nothing really matters. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes, it has two speakers in it. And the guys at the Bible Project, they refer to these two characters as the author and the teacher. Now, the author only speaks for a total of 7 verses of the entire book, but presumably the author collected the words of the teacher who, the teacher is otherwise the main voice throughout the book. The author clearly wants us to hear the words of wisdom spoken by the teacher, even though the author does provide some of his own commentary at the end of the book. The author never identifies himself. We don't ultimately know who they are. Who the teacher is, on the other hand, is a topic of much greater debate among scholars. Now, some scholars believe that the teacher is Solomon. Some believe that it was a later king of Judah. And others believe that it's simply someone who's continuing in the wisdom tradition that was begun by King Solomon, but is not King Solomon himself. But regardless of who the teacher actually is, who actually wrote it, I believe that the author is intending us to believe that the teacher is Solomon based on the description that he gives of their life. But the Solomon of Ecclesiastes does have a very different tone than the Solomon of Proverbs, and a very different sort of wisdom that he provides to the reader. And the wisdom provided here begins with these words. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 2 begins, "Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? Generations come, generations go, but the earth remains forever." And so hopefully you quickly understand here, even in these opening verses, why people have such a low view of the wisdom that the teacher provides in this book. I don't want to just read a whole book of someone telling me how meaningless life is. But that word, meaningless, is such a poor translation of the Hebrew word. And so then by being poorly translated, it completely changes the meaning and our understanding of the entire book. See, the word that we see as meaningless is actually the Hebrew word hevel. Hevel, when used in a non-metaphorical sense, is translated to mean vapor or breath. So how in the world do we go from the word vapor or breath to meaningless? Well, from a metaphorical perspective and the way that the word is used here in this book, hevel is meant to communicate the passing nature of things. So when you see steam or vapor around you, it disappears as quickly as it comes. You're not able to hold on to it. You're not able to make it stick around for longer. It's here and then it's gone. And secondly, if you've ever had to drive through the fog and the mist, you know that fog around you clouds the vision of things around you. Things are harder to see in the mist, and so too is life. Things are not always clear to us. And this is the point that the author is trying to make. Not that life has no purpose, not that life is meaningless and should be viewed with cynicism and indifference, but instead that life is fleeting and unclear. And yet we don't have a perfect English translation for that. But the way that we understand this word, hevel, is important because it's used dozens of times in 30 different verses throughout all of Ecclesiastes. It is the core theme of this book. And again, it's not to say that life doesn't matter, but it's to say that life is temporary and that all we will do will pass away. And we are thoroughly unable to understand everything that happens in this world. And so now that I've explained that word, hevel, I was unable to come up with an English word that I did feel fully encapsulates that concept. And so as I read scripture now for the rest of the sermon here, anytime we come across that word that is translated meaningless but is hevel, I'm just going to say the Hebrew word hevel, and I'll leave it to each of you to recognize the significance of that word, meaning and indicating both the fleeting nature of things and the foggy and unclear aspects of our lives that we can't fully comprehend. So at least in part, the struggle of the teacher with the futility and the fleeting nature of life is summarized in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 17 to 26. And it says this: "So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun is grievous to me. All of it is hevel, a chasing after the wind. I hated all of the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish? Yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil, into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is hevel. So my heart began to despair over all the toilsome labor under the sun. For a person may labor with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then they must leave all that they own to another who has not toiled for it. This too is hevel, and a great misfortune. What do people get for all the toil and anxious striving with which they labor under the sun? All their days, their work is grief and pain. Even at night, their minds do not rest. And this too is hevel. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is hevel, a chasing after the wind. For all the labors of our life is only temporary. And then when we're gone, we will pass all of the work of our life on to someone else who will do with it whatever they see fit. And so goes the cry of the teacher, as he declares the inevitability of the passage of time and our march on toward death. Really fun and uplifting stuff here, right? But wait, there's more. The teacher isn't done, because as the book continues then, the teacher declares the hevel, the fleeting and unclear nature of wisdom, of folly, of toil, of advancing one's status in life, of riches, and perhaps other things that I overlooked as well. But he declares all of these things hevel, and then all of those things culminate with perhaps the grandest and the most hevel thing among all the rest, the randomness of life. Ecclesiastes 8 says this, starting in verse 14. There is something else hevel that occurs on earth. The righteous who get what the wicked deserve, and the wicked who get what the righteous deserve. This too, I say, is hevel. The teacher knows that the wisdom of Proverbs doesn't necessarily always hold true. Just because we do right, just because we honor God, doesn't mean that life is going to go perfectly well for us. In fact, based on pretty much everyone's universal experience, there's some good and there's some bad to life. And there's not always ways to control either one of those things. Sometimes life just happens. Sometimes, as the teacher puts it, the righteous get what the wicked deserve, and sometimes the wicked get what the righteous deserve. Sometimes, despite our best desires and intentions to honor and obey God, things don't feel like they're working out for us. And sometimes, despite a person's abysmal character and moral failures, they get raised up and celebrated. How does that make sense? And this is exactly the tension that the author and teacher in Ecclesiastes expect and desire for us to sit in. But this is where we begin to see then the real wisdom that the book of Ecclesiastes is trying to impart to its readers in the verses that follow. Continuing in Ecclesiastes 8, continuing in verse 15, it says this: "So I commend the enjoyment of life, because there is nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany them in their toil for all the days of the life that God has given them under the sun. When I applied my mind to know wisdom, to observe the labor that is done on the earth, people getting no sleep day or night. Then I saw all that God has done. No one can comprehend what goes on under the sun. Despite all their efforts to search it out, no one can discover its meaning. Even if the wise claim that they know, they cannot really comprehend it. The teacher doesn't recognize the hevel, the fleeting and unclear nature of life, and see an excuse for just throwing up his hands in misery and dejection for the rest of his days. If anything, the hevel of life is even more reason to find joy in the little things. If things are random and sometimes bad things happen to good people, then why should we not just find joy in the little things as we're able? Eat, drink, be glad, take pleasure in the little moments in life wherever you can, because no one can or ever will fully understand God's world and all that happens here. And hear that last line of that passage, even if the wise claim they know, they cannot really comprehend it. God is God. He made the world. He controls it, not us. And so we're not ever going to be able to fully understand it all. Now, I think the teacher would agree with the words of the prophet Isaiah when Isaiah speaks these words from the Lord in Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. He says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts." And so the teacher continues then on this train of thought that we can't understand the randomness of life. We can't understand everything that happens here. And so then the teacher continues and he says this in Ecclesiastes 9, starting in verse 1. "So I reflected on all this and concluded that the righteous and the wise and what they do are in God's hands, but no one knows whether love or hate awaits them. All share a common destiny, the righteous and the wicked, the good and the bad, the clean and the unclean, those who offer sacrifices and those who do not. As it is with the good, so with the sinful. As it is with those who take oaths, so with those who are afraid to take them. So go, eat your food with gladness, and drink your wine with a joyful heart, for God has already approved what you do. Always be clothed in white, and always anoint your head with oil. Enjoy life with your wife whom you love, all the days of this hevel life that God has given you under the sun, all your hevel days. For this is your lot in life, and in your toilsome labor under the sun, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For in the realm of the dead where you are going, there is neither working, nor planning, nor knowledge, nor wisdom." The teacher still is encouraging us to live well and to enjoy life. But also, relax. We don't have to have everything figured out. We don't have to know the mind of God. It's okay for us to take joy and pleasure in life's little moments, to work hard, to love our spouse, not because it's going to guarantee a long or easy or happy life, but because we're not a people who were made to be miserable. But instead, we were made to enjoy this good world that God has placed us in. The teacher continues and he ends with the same words that he began with in the second verse of the book. So in Ecclesiastes 12:8, the teacher says this, "Hevel, hevel," says the teacher. Everything is hevel. And so this is the point of the teacher. But the author has not yet gotten the last word in. So after the teacher concludes with his words there in verse 8, the author finally chimes in and gives his 2 cents in Ecclesiastes 12:9-14. He says, "Not only was the teacher wise, but he also imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. The teacher searched to find just the right words, and what he wrote was upright and true. The words of the wise are like goads. Their collected sayings like firmly embedded nails, given by one shepherd. Be warned, my son, of anything in addition to their words. Of making many books there is no end, and much study wearies the body. Now all has been heard, and so here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God, and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. The author still lifts up the words of the teacher as right and good and wise and teaching to be heard and observed. But the author makes clear for us what he sees as a proper interpretation and application of the teacher's words. Yes, life may be hevel, it may be fleeting and unclear at times, but we must still fear God and keep his commandments, knowing and trusting that God will deal with the final outcome and judgment of all things, good and evil, even if people don't necessarily get what we think they deserve here on this side of heaven. And this is where Jesus comes in. For us, as Christians, Jesus is one of the few things that stands out in the midst of the hevel. In all the chaos and madness, the uncertainty and random nature of our world, Jesus stands apart as the hope that we have in the midst of the hevel. Because the issue with life is that it's fleeting and it is uncertain. There is going to be an end to our time here, no matter how hard we may try. But is this not what makes Jesus so extraordinary in the grand scheme of our lives? The God that we worship is not bound up by time and space as we know it, but is eternal. The things that we do to build our status, our wealth, our kingdoms here on this earth will pass away, but there is a kingdom that is eternal. There is a kingdom that will never pass away, whose king is good and loving and kind and wise beyond all measure. And if we spend our lives pouring into that kingdom, then how much more does that remove the hevel of this world? As we reflect on the wisdom of Ecclesiastes, we're reminded of the profound truth that life, in all of its complexities and uncertainties, is indeed fleeting and unclear. It's like chasing after the wind, as the teacher puts it. Yet in the midst of this existential crisis that we all face, there's a call to embrace joy, to find contentment in the simple pleasures of life. We're encouraged to work diligently, to love deeply, and to savor every moment, knowing that ultimately our lives are in the hands of God. But beyond the mystery of the passing nature of life lies a beacon of hope that transcends the hevel of this world. That hope is found in Jesus Christ, who offers us an eternal kingdom where the struggles of this life fade away and where God's wisdom and love reign supreme. In Jesus, we discover a purpose that surpasses the passing vapor of earthly existence and offers a promise of everlasting joy in the presence of our Creator. And so, may we heed the wisdom of Ecclesiastes, fearing God and keeping his commandments, and knowing that in doing so we align ourselves with the eternal purposes of his kingdom. And as we journey through the hevel of life, may we fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who leads us from the temporary to the eternal, from the fleeting to the everlasting.